Thank you all very much. I should say for starters that intellectually, I'm pretty largely a product of the CSS of the early 1970s, which was a wonderfully intense experience where we were essentially force-fed philosophy of science, philosophy of social science, much of which I was not quick enough to grasp at the time. But for over 45 years now, I've been a historian. And I have learned very deeply that, there are facts, there is truth, there are many things that are false. But my perspective on the world was very much informed, if not formed, by the CSS faculty and other people like Phil Halley and David Morgan from the early 70s there at Wes. Some of you who are in CSS probably know that my first book on Dr. King, Protest at Selma, 45 years ago now, began as my CSS honors thesis in 1974, 1975. If there's one thing that I've learned beyond the specifics of my work over this 45 plus years, it's that the extent of human evil is greater than is usually appreciated. And I know that apart from even my work on Dr. King. I've had a hobby, a sidebar for decades now of trying to understand why the extent of human evil is so great. And even though I've been immersed in Martin Luther King for 45 years now, one of the most important critical things that I can say about Dr. King was that he underestimated, underappreciated the extent of human evil. Now, in King's case, that may not be so surprising because even though he grew up in a rigidly segregated society, he was a child of privilege. He had a very happy, largely insulated childhood as the son of a prominent Black Baptist Atlanta minister. And King wrote in a essay when he was 16, 17 years old, that it was very easy for him to believe that the universe was friendly. He had an innate optimism that came from what a loving and supportive childhood and teenage years he had. Now, most of you probably rightly associate King with nonviolence. And King himself, multiple times, described himself as a pacifist. But he really wasn't a total pacifist, because as he said very strikingly in a talk only about 3 weeks before he was assassinated, that in a war against Hitler, he would have fought. And he would have fought and taken up arms because Hitler was such an evil force in history. That's March 14th, 1968 in Michigan, outside of Detroit. King realized that a genocidal regime like the Nazis, like the Hitler government, was different in kind from the other sources of human conflict and violence that we see in the world, both domestically and internationally. King was a very tough, outspoken critic early on of American involvement in Vietnam, because he perceived correctly that we were not on the side of the angels in what we were doing in Southeast Asia. But no matter how many times he spoke out against violence in the world, about the danger of nuclear war, of nuclear weapons, he understood that genocidal regimes were different. Um, and he said at another time, a little bit earlier, and this is a very important quote, I think, for people to absorb and ponder, that the ultimate logic of racism is genocide. Now, King didn't talk about the Holocaust or the Nazi regime very often, but that quote, that racism is genocide, is extremely important for us to appreciate in the world today when we see on a day-to-day basis in Ukraine a genocidal racist regime that is the most dangerous force in the world since 1945. And I would do you all a disservice, being 50 years older than all of you, if I did not stress to you that what's happening in Ukraine is the most important thing that's occurred during my lifetime, period. We must care humongously about the future of Ukraine, the victory of Ukraine, and the defeat and disassemblement of the racist, genocidal Putin Russian regime. I think oftentimes in our lives, things that are close to us can look large, and things that are far away from us can look small. Now, one of my other books was The Standard History of Roe v. Wade. And you all know that 9 months ago, we lost Roe v. Wade, which was a tremendously sad, though unfortunately foreseeable thing. So, bad things happen in the world. Bad things happen here in the United States. I sit about 6 blocks away from where a mass murderer targeting Jews here in Squirrel Hill, Pittsburgh, killed 11 people several years ago. He still hasn't stood trial. And we see this genocidal impulse in other regimes today. Iran wanting to eliminate Jews, China targeting Muslims. But what's happening in Ukraine is the most pressing crisis of all. And even someone as committed to the elimination of violence, the elimination of militarism, as Martin Luther King, would realize the Putin-Hitler connection. I want to say, before I close, 3 or 4 useful things to you. The Russian regime has been trying to poison people for years now. Litvinenko, the Skripals, Alexei Navalny. Navalny, if you don't know that name, look him up, Alexei Navalny, who's in a gulag someplace. The most courageous Russian dissenter still alive. But Europe matters to us. I mean, there's a very important election today in Estonia, which will determine whether Kaja Kallas remains as prime minister. Most of the people who've worked with me in organizing this were female. And I wanted to just say, for people to appreciate, how much of today's great leadership in Europe is female. Maya Sandu in Moldova, Zuzana Kaputova in Slovakia, Kaja Kallas in Estonia, Sanna Marin in Finland, Annalena Baerbock, the wonderful German foreign minister. So please pay attention to Europe. The best coverage of Ukraine is in The Guardian, the British paper, theguardian.com. There's a wonderful website based here in the US called understandingwar.org, that I look at every night or every morning if I go to bed too early. And we need to have a much greater understanding of the international scene than today's US journalism now gives us. The qualitative decline of major US newspapers has been one of the saddest things of my adult life this last 10 plus years. We see so little about Africa, about South America, about much of Asia in the US press now. Each week I look forward tremendously to reading The Economist, a weekly British magazine. And it's a perhaps sad comment on the United States that The Guardian and The Economist are, for me, now my top two news sources, as someone who's written for the US press for decades now. So thank you very much. CSS and Wesleyan were, the formative experience of my life. I know Ambassador Hunter, who's older than I am, is scheduled up next. He knows Europe a whole lot better than I ever will. Ukraine defines our future, and everyone should pay attention to that and root for Ukraine on a regular basis. Slava Ukraini.